Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Searing-Young, and I am the director of the Greenbelt Museum. Thank you for coming. The first thing I'd like to do is start with a land acknowledgement, noting that the Greenbelt Museum is situated on the traditional lands of the Piscataway and the Piscataway-Conoy people, who were here long before Europeans arrived to occupy their lands. We've started doing these land acknowledgements, and I think it's important to do them. So welcome to those of you who are new to our programs. Thank you so much for coming. And just to give you some background, we're a museum here in Greenbelt, Maryland, which is one of the 3 experimental green towns built in 1937 as part of the New Deal. The museum is a public-private partnership by the city of Greenbelt and the nonprofit Friends of the Greenbelt Museum. We focus on a range of topics that intersect with Greenbelt's history, including the Great Depression, the New Deal, cooperatives, World War II, segregation, civil rights, citizen activism, and much more. We operate a house museum, we do walking tours, we host a lecture series, and many other programs and activities throughout the year. If you haven't already, we encourage you to sign up for our electronic newsletter. You can do that at greenbeltmuseum.org. We only send about 1 to 2 messages per month on average, so we won't flood your inbox. It's a great way to stay up to date on progress on our expansion to 10A Crescent and everything else that we're doing. We do all this with myself. I'm a full-time employee, and my colleague is here on the call as well, Sheila Maffay Tuthill, who is our education and volunteer coordinator. And we are seeking volunteers, so if anyone is interested, please get in touch with us. Right now, the Museum House has a display of vintage Halloween decorations, and for those who are local, we encourage you to come by on Sundays 1 to 5, and also to check out the many October events that are happening. You can look at the City of Greenbelt's event calendar. I also wanted to highlight an event coming up very soon. That's the Greenbelt Black History and Culture Committee. It's hosting in honor of Maryland's Emancipation Day. It's a film called Descendants, about the last Africans who were brought from West Africa to Alabama. It's scheduled for November 4th, 2 p.m. at Greenbelt Cinema. And as always, for more information about us and what we do, please visit our website at greenbeltmuseum.org. Turning to tonight, we are so pleased to welcome the grandson of a Greenbelt pioneer family and someone who grew up in Greenbelt himself. And his name is Jonathan Maffay. Dr. Maffay holds a PhD from the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and an MA in Counseling Education, both from Ohio University. He's an existential psychotherapist in Athens, Ohio, working in community mental health. He actually wrote his dissertation on Diego Rivera and his Mexico City murals depicting the history of Mexico from a Mexican perspective. We're so pleased to have him tonight. Please join me in welcoming him. Dr. Maffay, if you'd like to take it up from here, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Megan. I'm so happy to be here tonight. As Megan mentioned, I'm a Greenbelter from way back, but I haven't lived in Greenbelt for almost 40 years now. So it's been a while since I've lived in Greenbelt, but I feel very close to my experiences there growing up. And I'm so happy tonight that I can share with you an interest I've had for a long time in Diego Rivera, the artist. Let me explain a little bit that interest. Back in the late 70s, I took off to travel through Latin America, and my first stop was Mexico. And I really fell in love with Mexico and the Mexican people. And I visited many of the ruins, the Monte Albans and the Palenques, and all the different Mayan and Toltec and Aztec sites in Mexico. And that began in me an interest that I followed up in when I decided to write a doctoral dissertation about Diego Rivera. And I shared with him his enthusiasm for ancient Mexico and their customs and their people and their art and things like that. So as a part of my background in the arts, in addition to having a PhD in the arts, here in Athens, Ohio, for a number of years, I was the art music critic for the local newspaper, the Athens News. So I've always enjoyed art, going to art openings, working with the artists, meeting the artists, writing stories, critiquing the works and things like that. So I'm very comfortable with that. And tonight I get a chance to do something I haven't done in about 20 years. I haven't taught a class at the university. I used to teach art history classes at Ohio University. But I haven't done that in about 20 years, so I might be a little rusty tonight, so please bear with me. But I'm really looking forward to sharing this talk about Diego Rivera and the working class hero. When Mexican muralist Diego Rivera arrived to the U.S. in the early 1930s during the Great Depression, he saw less the struggle of the working class, but more the hope of what a modern industrial economy might offer the working class. This sense of optimism resonates throughout the murals he painted in the United States, first in San Francisco and then in Detroit. That same optimism also resonates within the works of many New Deal WPA artists, an FDR era program to put people back to work during those difficult economic times. As a matter of fact, it was Rivera and his fellow Mexican muralists, including Jose Clemente Orozco and David Alfaro Siqueiros, the so-called Tres Grandes, who inspired the New Deal program. Diego Rivera was a larger-than-life figure who, along with his third wife, Frida Kahlo, in the 1930s and 40s, were arguably one of the most famous and controversial couples in the whole world. Their influence was felt not only in the world of art, but also in politics, as they were outspoken in their communist beliefs and were at the center of one of the most famous political assassinations of the 20th century. While a guest at the Riveras in Mexico City, the exiled communist leader Leon Trotsky was murdered by a political opponent in 1940. Rivera's influence in the arts is no less interesting. He was an accomplished and successful mural painter using a Renaissance true fresco technique, which he employed to create vast public murals throughout Mexico. Murals that educated the Mexican people, many of them who were illiterate at that time, back in those days, about their glorious past before Cortez and the Spanish conquistadores arrived and destroyed their civilization. Rivera has been often described as having a romantic tendency in the way he depicts everyday people, whether it is his monumental works depicting the tribal people of ancient Mexico or the workers at the Ford automobile factory in Detroit. The viewer will notice the profound respect with which Rivera renders his subjects. He respected the working class, whether Mexican or American, and painted them with a sense of dignity. As an up-and-coming artist in Mexico, Diego Rivera was awarded a 4-year scholarship to study in Europe. He left for Europe in 1907 when he was 21, and he did not return until his mid-30s. He left for Europe in 1907 when he was 21 and didn't return until 1921 when he was in his mid-30s. While abroad, two of Rivera's most famous or important influences were the Italian Renaissance mural fresco technique and Picasso's Cubism, an interesting dichotomy of the traditional and the modern. His circle of acquaintances in Europe included Picasso and other young avant-garde artists who were creating a stir back then with their Cubist abstractions. In this painting, View of Toledo, Rivera paints from the same vantage point in which El Greco, 400 years earlier, a seminal influence on Rivera, painted it. This work also shows the influence of the French painter Cézanne, as it shows the juxtaposition of forms in space, a precursor to Rivera's Cubist periods. The sun-soaked vista exudes a relaxed positivity, which much different than the El Greco version with its stormy, foreboding atmosphere. Let me show you that El Greco version, and you'll know what I'm talking about, the foreboding atmosphere. So 400 years earlier, virtually from the same spot, El Greco painted this. And if you see that foreboding kind of moody atmosphere that El Greco depicted, and compared that to this more sunny, optimistic, positive rendering of the same subject matter by Rivera. Perhaps Rivera's most famous work during this Cubist period is his painting that references the Mexican Revolutionary revolutionary Emiliano Zapata. With traditional native Mexican textiles here, you can see in the painting, you can see the mountains of Mexico in the background. You can see a rifle that would suggest the revolution that was going on in Mexico. Because at this time, Mexico was in the midst of a revolution that lasted 10 years. It was the bloodiest war ever fought in the Americas. Over 1 million people died in that revolution. And as a result, the 30-year Diaz dictatorship was overthrown and a constitutional republic was founded in Mexico. But of course, Rivera was in Europe at that time. So he was far from the violence. He was safe from the violence that consumed so many Mexican people during that period. This is one of the reasons why critics often say that his works are oftentimes less strident in their revolutionary zeal than other murals like Orozco and Siqueiros, like I mentioned before. When considering Rivera's vast oeuvre over the course of his lifetime, there are other dichotomies in addition to the Renaissance modern already discussed. For example, he was considered one of the foremost authorities on the cultures and art of ancient Mexico, with an encyclopedic knowledge that informed his art throughout his career. Alfonso Caso, the director of the world-class Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, was impressed by Rivera's private collection of some 50,000 artifacts from pre-Columbian Mexico, and how Rivera was able to identify the provenance of the artifacts, save only a few. In the US, Rivera was just as fascinated by the cutting-edge Ford auto assembly line in Detroit, the most advanced in the world. He spent 2 months there before starting his Detroit murals that we'll see later on, exploring the different Ford factories night and day, sketching the assembly lines and industrial machinery used in the manufacturing process. As a matter of fact, Edsel Ford, then the president of Ford Motors, once remarked that Rivera knew more about mechanics than he did. When Rivera returned to Mexico, his timing was impeccable. Mexico was just embarking upon a vast public art project, and Rivera was enlisted to lead the way. During this time, Rivera was paid to travel around Mexico in order to reconnect to his native country. After being away so many years, he used the opportunity to draw and sketch the people and places he saw during his travels. This helped prepare him to paint the various monumental mural cycles on the walls of different government buildings throughout Mexico. And at this time, it is at this time that Rivera really began to infuse his work with a sensitivity towards the everyman and every woman. This is where his vision of the everyday hero becomes noticeable as he renders his humble Mexican subjects in what I prefer to call a heroic manner. This painting, Distribution of Arms, we see Rivera's communist politics becoming evident in his work, as he references his political beliefs here, and also the political beliefs of his wife, his third wife, Frida Kahlo. She's depicted here in the mural with a star, with a communist star on her blouse there, and receiving weapons from other revolutionaries. And it was at this time that Rivera's reputation in Mexico began to be questioned in a way. For the conservative religious types in Mexico, they found themselves in disagreement with Rivera's godless communism, while the radicals on the left were critical of his role as an artist for the rich and the famous. As a matter of fact, in 1929, Rivera was expelled from the Communist Party of Mexico. Now, one of my favorite of all the Riveran mural cycles is the one in Chapingo at the Autonomous University at Chapingo. And they have a chapel there. I guess you would call it a secular chapel. But this chapel, I was there, it's a small chapel, but the work is so powerful. It just, you can see the whole chapel here in this particular image. And on this work, this is something that Rivera chose to illustrate the theme of a parallel kind of evolution of where we had communist revolution on one side of the aisle, and on the other side of the aisle, the evolution of nature. These two themes mirror each other, communism versus paganism, along opposing walls. In this work, Rivera included both Aztec and Christian symbolism. He was capable of conceiving art such as this in the context of its historic potential, rather than just personal and political ideology. Like I said, I had the pleasure of going to this site, and it's perhaps my favorite of all Riveran sites. And I'm going to show you a couple of other panels from this particular Chapingo Chapel cycle. This is in the apse of the chapel, and the name of this piece is this part of the cycle is let's see, I have to get that here. Let's see, The Liberated Earth. That's what it is. The Liberated Earth. In this monumental mural, what I believe we begin to see here is Rivera's clearest indication of his own personal belief system. The full name of this panel is The Liberated Earth with Natural Forces Controlled by Man. In other words, the fecundity and abundance of nature as represented in Rivera's depiction of his pregnant second wife, Guadalupe Marin, being combined with human resourcefulness and technology that leads the way into the future. Another panel in this Chapingo cycle is this Triumph of the Revolution. This particular panel shows the liberated workers enjoying a meal together with modern farm equipment in the background. The warm, earthy palette evokes a sense of calm and connection to both nature and each other. It shows the Mexican peasants on their recently acquired land obtained through the revolution and land reform, enjoying the fruits of their labor. Another panel from this cycle is Revolution Germination. In this image, you have the burial of a revolutionary fighter. This painting, once again, employs that warm, earthy palette, but this time, this sense of calm has a portentous quality. Rivera suggests with this title, The Death of the Revolutionary, an organic process in which the death of one freedom fighter fertilizes the future for others who will continue the struggle for justice. Now we're moving on to a work that was done in the Palace of Mexico, a mural cycle there. And this is a cycle that described, it's entitled Totonac Civilization. Rivera's National Palace murals evoke the ancient greatness of pre-Columbian Mexico. When Cortez and his fellow conquistadores arrived to ancient Mexico, they were astounded by the beauty and order of its cities. They proclaimed Tenochtitlan, the capital, the Aztec capital, with its wide avenues and impressive step pyramids, the most beautiful city in the world. Keep in mind, this was at a time when Spain was the strongest country in Europe and very familiar with Europe's great cities. But that did not stop the Spaniards from dismantling the Aztec capital and using the materials to build Mexico City, the capital of Spain's first conquest in the New World. This was the very beginning of Europe's colonization of the Americas. And this is an area where Rivera is really expert. He really understood the ancient history of Mexico. This panel features a sprawling perspective of this ancient pre-Columbian city, Totonac city, with a variety of detail, including historical architecture, the step pyramids I mentioned a moment ago, weaponry, clothing. This was the city of the Jaguar people in Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico. Throughout Mexico, there are innumerable vast ruins of ancient cities left by the many tribes, ranging from the Aztecs, Mixtecs, Olmecs, Mayans, to name only a few. And as I've visited many of those sites, and I can tell you from my personal experience having studied these sites and photographed these sites and learned about these sites, I can attest to their impressive grandeur. Next, we move to Detroit in the Detroit Institute of Art. As Rivera's fame grew, he came to the attention of a number of wealthy patrons in the United States, who then commissioned him to come and adorn the walls of several very important buildings in this country. Rivera arrived to the U.S. in 1930, in the early days of the Great Depression. His first commission was at the San Francisco Stock Exchange. His work there attracted the attention of the Henry Ford family, the Henry Ford family in Detroit, owners of the most modern factories in the world. The Ford family wanted to show the world through Rivera's eyes and art their great accomplishment, the auto assembly line and mass production. Rivera was fascinated at the prospect of being able to learn about the industrial process and then being able to paint the inner workings of high-tech 1930s style. Rivera considered this his masterpiece, and many critics have agreed. Now, this is in Detroit, the Detroit Institute of Art, and this is the centerpiece of the museum. This was a very controversial work when it was first created. A lot of people were, and we'll look at this in more detail in just a moment, but a lot of people were, well, for instance, you might recall the name Father Charles Coughlin. His parish was actually in the suburb of Detroit, and he was famous back in the 1930s for being a strident anti-communist, and he was appalled that the Ford family would invite a well-known communist painter to decorate the walls of Detroit's art museum. So Father Conklin was a big critic, and many people also criticized. You'll see nudity. I think you'll see up here. We'll see more detail here and here. So it was a controversial work, but the Ford family stuck by Rivera, and they said, no, we appreciate what he's doing here. So they allowed the work to continue. Let me show you some kind of drawings. This is how, kind of gives you an idea of how Rivera works. Rivera would start with a very rough sketch like we see right here. And then from that, he would then create this cartoon. And this cartoon is only about 3 to 4 feet in width here. So it's not very large. But then he would go and then paint. Well, let me back up. In the past, let's say during the Renaissance, in let's say Florence in Italy, this cartoon then would then be adhered to the wall where the wet plaster was. And they would use a stylus to then puncture all these little, they would outline this whole work with little holes, punctured holes with a stylus. And then they would take charcoal dust and blow it through the perforations in the cartoon, or cartone, as they say in Italy. And as they pulled the cartone away, the cartoon away, they would see a black and white image. Then that would be painted over by the artist. Rivera dispensed with that last step. He went straight from this cartoon, for instance, this cartone, and then he painted freehand on the wet plaster in the Detroit Institute of Art. Here's another image. This is the north wall of this main courtyard area. And this is you'll notice here that Rivera, while he's referencing the industrial process here, the most modern factory in the world we're seeing here, then he's also referencing the fact that, well, all the materials that come in order to create this modern marvels actually come from the earth. We see the subterranean earth here. We see some of the mythical, Rivera being a Mexican, where there's a lot of belief in the traditional Mexican culture and their gods and goddesses. So we see references to traditional belief systems. We see reference to subterranean earth here, where the materials that are used in production come from, and then we see the factory floor here. going to show you a closer up image of the factory floor. And here you see the blast furnace up here, and from this the molten metals are then come down through these lines, these pipelines. They then enter. They're then poured into these molds, and they're different auto parts. Sheet metal is produced. Different auto parts are produced as through this whole process from the blast furnaces all the way to the finished product. In the Ford factories, they did everything. Nothing was farmed out. Nothing was hired out. They did the whole process from beginning to end, every step of the way. Yet another image, even closer up, shows you here the same image, but here we begin to see the workers of different ethnicities. Some Latino-looking guy here, and some African-American-looking guy here, and some Anglo-American guy here. All these different ethnicities working together. With this powerful machinery to create the automobiles in circa 1932. This is like I said, painted in the early 30s. Now there's another. I'm going to go to another wall here, the south wall of the. Let's see here. The north wall that's there here. Now let me go to the south wall here. Now we go to the south wall. On the south wall, once again, we see this reference to the prima materia, the materia prima, the raw materials that go into the manufacturing process. And once again, we see this evocation of traditional, ancient, what we might even call pagan beliefs. But we also see here on the south wall the production of the exterior parts of the car. The north wall, they showed the production of the interior parts of the car, the engine, the transmission, and things like that. And on the south wall here, we see the process where they produce the exterior parts of the wall, the doors and bumpers and things like that. Let me get a little bit closer here, so you can see this. So here we are watching this process once again. You can see here, here we see the people. This was such a marvel for the people of Detroit that they would come, and this is a crowd. They would just go there to watch this. This is an incredible marvel. And this is, like I said, this is the most advanced factory in the world, and people would come to watch the workers as they worked. Interestingly, this machine right here, this press machine, this is the one machine that was not painted exactly accurately as it was in the Detroit factory, in the Ford factory. Rivera was quite interested. This reminded him of this machine I'll show here close up. This Mexican goddess of fertility. I can never say this right. Cuatloque, I think. Cuatloque, that's how you pronounce it. It's I guess a Nahuatl name, Cuatloque. And Rivera was drawing an analogy. He was making a comparison. He was connecting his understanding of ancient Mexico, and this machine, as he depicted it in this mural, actually doesn't look like in the factory, but kind of looks a little bit like this particular carving from ancient Mexico. Very interesting. He could never leave his homeland behind. Wherever he went, he seemed to take a love and a respect and an affection for Mexico with him. Now I have a brief video I wanted to show you. This video is it's a black and white silent video back showing Rivera at the Detroit Institute of Art and how he worked. Let me go ahead and get it started for you, and I'll make a few comments as we go. But let me get this started. Here we see the scaffolding in the museum. One of the cartoons there. And now we see, here we come, Rivera's coming up soon. He's working by himself here. He did this whole project in 9 months. This is a massive project. People are amazed that this guy basically working alone. This monumental project he was able to do in nine months. So it was astounding to people that he could accomplish this masterpiece in such a short period of time. Notice the vigorous brush strokes, So this is the wet plaster that he's painted on. So you can't really make a mistake on this. This is kind of an unforgiving medium, working with this fresco process. So you have to get it right the first time, because what actually happens as it dries, the actual tint, the paint, the color is actually, I guess you'd say, baked into the plaster. You can't just wash it off. I like this part here where they segue into the modern version of this, how, 100 years later, this is what it looks like now. After Detroit, Rivera was invited to go by the Rockefeller family to go to New York City and to paint a mural cycle at the Rockefeller Center, in Midtown Manhattan. Rivera, when he and Frida got to New York, they were international celebrities at that time, so it was quite an event when they arrived to the city. And we see here with this work here, this actually is not the Rockefeller Center depiction, because, as I'm going to explain in a moment, this was actually destroyed by the Rockefeller family. And what Rivera did is, a number of years later in Mexico City, he took his drawings, his cartones, and he created the image in Mexico. But this is what it would have looked like if the the Rockefeller family would have allowed him to finish. What happened was, when the Rockefeller family realized that in this imagery, oh, look at this, there's Vladimir Lenin. Oh, there is Leon Trotsky. Oh, and there's Karl Marx, the trinity of communist leaders. The Rockefeller family asked Rivera to erase those images, not realizing you can't erase those images because they're embedded into the paint itself. But Rivera refused. He said that no, he would not remove those images. He said, my politics are well known. You knew my politics. You know that I'm a communist, and no, I'm not going to remove those faces. Well, the Rockefeller family didn't wait very long to let him know that, hey, here's your pay for your work. You're now fired from the job, and then they destroyed the mural that was in the process of being created. Now, interestingly, this mural, look at this. He shows two sides. This is the capitalist side over here. You see these guys, gas mask, and bayonets, and you see Charles Darwin here. Capitalism, the Darwinist survival of the fittest kind of mindset. But then we go over here to the revolutionary side, the communist side, and we see it looks much more hopeful. People, brighter colors, people more hopeful, people exercising, being in good health. So he really draws a stark contrast between this more foreboding capitalist side and this more optimistic, kind of colorful, and enlivening communist side. From there, we know that, I'm going to move to Greenbelt here. We know that although Rivera, that was his last New York City, the Rockefeller Center was his last mural cycle in the United States. He was never invited back again to create a mural in the United States. But that doesn't mean that his influence wasn't perpetrated in the United States. As I mentioned earlier, the WPA program, the Roosevelt FDR program to put people back to work during the 1930s, during the Depression, Rivera and the Mexican muralists are given a lot of credit in the literature, saying they were really the inspiration for the WPA and the artists being employed by the government to go and create art that would inspire the American people who were suffering through the worst the worst economic decline, the worst economic conditions this country ever experienced. So here in Greenbelt, the center school, Lenore Thomas's To Form a More Perfect Union is a sculpture that once again shows with respect how the respect that Rivera imbued with his works, the everyday people, the working class heroes. And we see in the WPA, the American artists picking up on that kind of respect for the working class people. And we see it very much so here in Thomas's sculpture at the center school. I have another image by Thomas at the center school. I'm sure you guys are quite familiar with the issue, Greenbelters. And this is the Ensured Domestic Tranquility. But also there were other artists, Thomas Hart Benton and other artists who were also employed by the WPA. This is a Thomas Hart Benton work. And notice once again the working class heroes doing the dirty work. Oftentimes the working class heroes were relegated the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs, and we see that here with these guys working this heavy equipment. They're heroic. They're in the way that they're depicted by Benton, much like the way the workers are depicted by Rivera. They have a heroic quality to them. Still I'm going to show another image from the WPA. This is the lumber manufacturing. Once again, we see the workers. This sense of respect, working class people doing their work, which enables the rest of us to have the products, the cars, the lumber, the homes that we need, and the working class people are the ones that create those, that allow that to happen. And we've sensed that respect by these WPA artists. Rivera's influence even continued into our present time. There's an artist in particular out in California that I'm going to bring out on the show. Excuse me, go back to this one right here. Judith Baca, Chicana artist in Los Angeles. She often has said how influenced she was by Diego Rivera and his different mural cycles throughout Mexico and the United States. And for many years, starting back in the 1970s, and I believe this artist continues to create these mural cycles throughout different areas of downtown Los Angeles. We have this mural here showing the Mexican laborers doing their field work as they've traditionally done, for many years here in the United States. You see another image here of what I would call what was called in Mexico La Raza Cósmica. Back in the time of Rivera, there was a term that was coined describing the Mexican people as La Raza Cósmica, the cosmic race. And what the cosmic race, or La Raza Cósmica, is what they call the fifth race, the synthesis of all the races, the blending of all the races, all the different people of the world is intermixing, creating the La Raza Cósmica, or the fifth race. So these people that Baca is depicting here would be considered La Raza Cósmica. Now, I would like to close, before we start a question and answer session, with an image that I quite like of Rivera and his most famous wife ever, Frida Kahlo. This is an image, I think, right about when they were married. Frida Kahlo is very young here. You see Rivera, a very large man. He was well over 6 feet tall, well over 300 pounds. In Mexico at that time, he was a giant. So he was not only a giant in the world of art, the world of politics, but physically he was a giant man. But we see here Frida Kahlo. And interestingly, these days, Frida Kahlo, in many ways, is probably more recognized or even more famous than Diego Rivera. Although she was what you might call a naive artist. She wasn't really trained as an artist. She wasn't academically trained. I guess we could also call her a visionary artist. Visionary artist, that's the term I prefer to use. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever been to the Visionary Museum in Baltimore, but I definitely recommend that you go there. But visionary art is art created by people who were not academically trained. And Frida Kahlo was one of those. She was a visionary artist. So with that, I'm going to end my talk, and I'd like to invite my wife, Dr. Isabel Graziani, to join us here. Isabel is a professor of art history at a small university here in Ohio. And she teaches art history, and interestingly, this week her students are learning about Diego Rivera and the Mexican muralist. So I asked Isabel, I said, hey, would you care to join us when I give this talk to the Greenbelt Museum about Diego Rivera? And so Dr. Graziani, my wife, has agreed to join us. So as you have any questions, or if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. And Isabel and I will do our very best to answer them.
There we go. Anyone have questions?
Yes, I have a question. I grew up in the Detroit area, so seeing Rivera's murals at the Art Institute. And so when I was young, it struck me that how large they were, but also how the people were large people, you know, not I mean, they were big besides just being in size. And so just wonder, and sort of flat looking in some ways. So just wonder if you can comment on that.
Isabel, would you like to comment on that?
Oh, yeah.
I'll put
Hello.
on the spot here.
Hello,
Good to see you.
I'm Isabel. How are you? That's a very good point, actually. His style was what we call modernist style. He was kind of like, he had been trained in Europe, and this is the time for Cubism, Futurism, Modernism. So he adopted that visual language, and you can see that it's the flattening of the figure that we see, but at the same time, it's like that modernity reminds us that it is through modernity and machinery that perhaps the country can rise above, the economy can really improve. Because remember, he created these murals during the Depression era. So you've seen them. So can you share with us that experience of being there?
Well, I mean, I knew they were factory workers. I didn't know they were specifically from Ford Motor Company, but Ford, you know, has had a huge presence in the Detroit area. And so I just found them interesting because they were so different from all the rest of the art in the museum. And they were so massive, and you couldn't miss them when you walked in, you know. So it really made an impression. The other question I have is, was he still a communist, or were they both communists, you know, at the end of their lives?
Yes, they both were. People question, especially Rivera, I mentioned earlier, because sometimes because he worked for these famous rich families. And for instance, in the Detroit, just give you the example of the kind of payment he would receive for his work, and this was maybe why some of his fellow communists in Mexico were very wary of his communism per se. For instance, he was paid when he first arrived in Detroit and sized up the project. He said he was talking to the representatives of the Ford family, and they were told that we can pay you $10,000 for this project, Mr. Rivera. And Diego Rivera said, well, for $10,000, I can paint half of each wall. I can't paint the whole wall. I can paint half of each wall. And they said, half of each wall? And that's not going to work, sir. And he says, well, then you're going to have to pay me more. So he ended up being paid $21,000 for that work. And the budget for the Detroit Institute of Art in 1932, the year that was painted, was $60,000. He was paid 1/3 of the whole budget for the Detroit Institute of Art that year. So he was well remunerated. But as a consequence, the Detroit Institute of Art had the largest attendance in the history of their museum when that show opened. The record crowds there's never been larger crowds in the Museum of Detroit, the Detroit Institute of Art, than when Rivera's work was open to the public. So it was controversial, but it was well received. And the workers, the Ford auto workers at the different Ford plants and auto workers in general, were very supportive of this work and said that is very accurate. That very accurately depicts what we deal with, how we work, the conditions we work under.
Yeah, exactly. And adding to what Jonathan says, I thought that it was fascinating to see that the workers felt honored by Rivera. They felt recognized because Rivera, he puts them in the foreground. You can really see them as powerful heroes. And they thought, finally, someone is recognizing us for what we do. So it was an incredible game change for all these people. It's like they felt appreciated, and that is so important doing whatever you do. So great question. Thank you.
I have a question about other works that may have been destroyed. I know that you spoke about the Rockefeller mural. Were there other works of his that were either destroyed or have been sort of lost over the years? I know that's happened with some other WPA works, maybe not of his scale. So,
yeah. Not that I know of. As far as I know, the Rockefeller Center mural cycle was the only one that was destroyed. So I don't know of any others. No.
But so when it comes to the WPA, as we know, it's like that was a great way to generate jobs for so many people. But the people that actually hired the artists, they were also very conscientious of the message that you were going to give as an artist working for the WPA. And they were only looking for positive messages, nothing that was dealing with like strikes, racism, and nothing negative. It had to be positive.
And it couldn't be, it couldn't have any references to communism, because the WPA administrators were very careful to make sure that, yes, please paint all these public, please create all this public artwork, but if anything had any kind of reference to communism, the WPA administrators were on the lookout for that sort of thing to maintain a, we don't want to advertise this system of economic system that we're opposed to here in capitalist America. So it was interesting that way that how that played out for Rivera in Detroit.
And Megan, that's also a good question, because actually they threatened to destroy the murals in Detroit.
is that right?
Because of the nudity, and because of like all of a sudden the workers become more important than the machines. And actually the workers were guarding the works outside the museum for a while. So it is thanks to the workers that we have this mural.
That's so interesting. That's something Lenore Thomas Straus faced here as well in the bas-reliefs on the front of the school building. The one that she did to represent established justice, the original mock-up that she did was actually a lynching scene. It was a man being hung with hooded men with rifles beneath him, and then a judge and jury turning their backs on the proceedings. And needless to say, this was refused by her bosses in the resettlement administration, but we do have a mock-up of it. So we know that that's what she wanted to put on the front of the building, which was pretty bold considering it was, 1936. And this was going to be a elementary school. So it was not accepted. So.
Yeah, certain subjects, certain themes were not acceptable for the WPA. So that I'm not surprised. I hadn't heard that story, but that doesn't surprise me at all. Anything else? Any other questions?
There's a comment here. Native American says, Lisa Malone says, however, many WPA post office murals are debated maybe because of how Native Americans and African Americans are depicted. The post office mural in Virginia Beach is covered with a large cloth with the Postal Service logo. So not all, sorry, it's cut off. So not all WPA murals convey a happy message. Certainly true.
Yeah, that's interesting, but most of them are supposed to portray a positive image. It's like when we even think about, everybody knows about My Grandmother, right, by Dorothea Lange, for example. That is not a positive message. That is the reality of the times. And she got away showing us that because people were suffering, and these were hardworking people. So there are great comments here in the chat.
Are there any other questions?
Can you tell us a little bit more about his third wife? Frida?
Frida Kahlo?
Mhm.
Yes. Frida was she was a person who at a very young age had a terrible accident. She was run over by a streetcar in Mexico City, and she almost died as a teenager. And she spent the rest of her life suffering from those injuries. She was you'll see many images of her with different prosthetics. I can't hardly say the word that allowed her to move, a little bit more easily. But she was really injured very badly in that accident. But she was a bold young woman. She went when Rivera was working on one of his projects in Mexico City. She went and introduced herself, and she just kind of hung around, as he was working at that particular site, and very interested in what he was doing. And after a while, he became very interested in her. Frida Kahlo at this time, I'd say, is probably more famous than Diego Rivera. There's never been a feature film about Diego Rivera like there was about Frida Kahlo, right? With Hollywood production, which is quite a good movie. If you haven't seen it, I can recommend seeing it. But Diego Rivera, there's no feature film about him like that, although he does appear in the movie. But at this point in time, Frida, I would argue, I think in part because of feminism here in the United States, has become a very positive role model, very powerful figure for feminists in this country and around the world.
And she was a true communist. When they were in Detroit, she hated being in Detroit because she just missed Mexico. She was so funny. She thought, oh, he's doing little paintings. I am the true artist. She was very sure of herself. And one thing about Frida, she actually was the first woman that painted what it was to be a woman, what was to be given birth. She painted her pain, her suffering. We have never seen anyone that did that. So yeah, she was not academically trained, but she had an incredible imagination. And the narrative was so clear because no one has been as honest as she was as an artist. So she is, to me, it's Frida and her husband. That's the way I see it. For my husband is Rivera and his wife.
Well, they're both like I said, back in the 1930s and 40s, there was probably no more famous couple in the world than kind of like I guess we'd call it, even today would be some famous couple here today. But it's they were world famous, and they were as respected as artists. People would visit Mexico City, and that was always the place they would go. Let's go visit with the Riveras, Frida and Diego and Frida. They were superstars of their age.
I was going to, I have a question, but before I pose my question, I wanted to say we have a lot of experience with, at the Greenbelt Museum, people hearing about Eleanor Roosevelt's husband and some of his important contributions. So
yeah, what was his name again?
Another situation with a very strong woman. I just wanted, and I don't know if it fits in with this so well, but I just wanted to ask if could flesh out Trotsky and Rivera in Mexico. You mentioned he was in the mural. You could see Trotsky to the right of the mural. And I know Trotsky was somewhat invited to Mexico by Rivera and Kahlo, but I just don't know that much about it. And I wondered if you guys could flesh it out a little bit.
Well, Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union by Stalin. There was a power struggle in the Soviet Union. Trotsky lost that power struggle. Trotsky was the believer that the world revolution, the communist revolution, should be fought on all the continents, all over the world. It was the international approach to communism. And Joseph Stalin, his vision was different. Let's build communism first in the USSR, in this country, and down the road someday, maybe when we get it right here, once we have it, we can do it here. Maybe we can then talk about exporting communism to other countries. So fundamentally, it was Stalin. Let's build communism here, and Trotsky, let's build communism everywhere. Trotsky lost that power struggle in the Soviet Union, and so he was expelled from the Soviet Union. And it was difficult for him to find a place to go. It was Rivera actually who interceded on his behalf with the Mexican government, and he said, "Hey, I would like to invite Trotsky to stay with us. He's having trouble finding a place to, where he can move to. Can the Mexican government, if I allow, if he's a guest of mine, will you allow that?" So he used his influence in Mexico to allow that to happen. So when Trotsky arrived, there's an interesting little aside. He and Frida became very close to each other, and there's a bit of a scandalous thing that they were lovers, etc., etc. And so that happened too. Trotsky and Frida became very fond of each other. But then it is believed, and I don't know if they've ever really figured out exactly what happened, but they believe it was a Stalin agent who was actually the one that drove a pickaxe through Trotsky's head in Mexico City. So he died in a very brutal sort of way. But it was, he was a guest of the Riveras, and the Riveras had to pull some strings with the Mexican government to get him to be allowed to enter the country.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, I have one more question. Besides being communists who were not, welcome necessarily in some places because of that, the fact that they were from Mexico did not seem to inhibit their success, or just in those days that was not exactly a multiracial, multi-ethnic kind of welcoming place in the US and some other places. So how did they pull that off?
I think Rivera felt more comfortable in the United States. For example, as Isabel mentioned a few moments ago, Frida was not nearly as comfortable. She didn't really like the United States. She missed Mexico very much. Their communism, yeah, I guess at the time we're talking about the 1930s, and that was a time when communism was ascendant. That was a time during the Great Depression, probably when I think the Communist Party of this country and most countries around the world were probably at their peak numbers, probably during the Depression. I don't know that for sure, but I would imagine that to be true from how I understand that situation. So it wasn't so controversial everywhere, I guess, because there are many parts of the world where I think communism was very, very appealing to, especially the downtrodden, the people who were living on very little. So while in the United States it might have been pretty controversial, and I think in a lot of other countries maybe not quite as controversial. Although Trotsky seems, going back to Trotsky, he does seem to have had the reputation of being a provocateur. And I don't think the Riveras quite had that reputation of being revolutionary provocateurs like Trotsky. So I think they were received differently in places. Trotsky was not granted the kind of access that maybe Diego Rivera and Frida were, for example.
And also, I just wanted to add something that Rivera at that time in the 30s, he was as famous as Picasso or Matisse. So for the Americans to be able to bring someone like Rivera to paint these murals in San Francisco, in Detroit was the most important city of the United States at that time. So if you have the most important city, you want to bring one of the best artists in the world. So at that time, they thought, who cares about his politics? He's one of the best muralists in the world, if not the best. So this is the reason why they hire him.
He's generally considered, the literature says that the Riveran cycles, both in Detroit, also in San Francisco and Mexico, the totality of his oeuvre would probably, it's been described, not probably, it's considered the greatest fresco mural work since the Renaissance. Nobody has painted, according to the critics, using that medium, fresco murals, nobody has painted as well and as voluminously as Rivera. So it's the greatest output of that type of work using that medium since the Renaissance.
There are just a few more comments in the chat. One, about mentioning that Rachel Maddow's, there's a Rachel Maddow podcast that's discussed, oh, I've lost it now, that's discussed Ford's anti-Semitism, and I've lost it now. The commenter says that they found the reference to Ford Coughlin as anti-communist somewhat inadequate, and they referenced this discussion that Rachel Maddow had about Ford's anti-Semitism, and called them, Ford and Coughlin were America's most vociferous and dangerous anti-Semites during the period of the Detroit murals. So if people want to learn more about that, they can go to the MSNBC website and find that. Let's see. They also mentioned that Kahlo's self-portrait at the time of Trotsky's murder can be seen at the National Museum of Women in the Arts here in DC.
And if you haven't been to that museum, it's a great museum to visit. It's absolutely amazing. They have incredible jewels there. So,
indeed, they do. Are there any more questions? If not, I think we will wrap this up. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. It's been,
I just snuck in myself.
Oh, I'm so, it's such a bonus. I mean, you know, we're so happy that you're there and that you happen to be so knowledgeable about this topic as well. I was an art history major, so it's all near and dear to my heart as well. If any of you want to learn more about the museum, please visit greenbeltmuseum.org. There's folks saying thank you for the wonderful presentation in the chat. I echo that as well. Thank you both so much. And Sheila, would you like to say anything? Because you were the one that brought this this lecture to us, since you're a relation of the speaker.
Well, I knew that this would be just a really fascinating and wonderful topic for us. So many points that connect with our story. So, and it was beautifully done, Jonathan. Thank you. And Chabela, thanks for the assist as well. We've all had a wonderful evening of learning this evening. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks to everyone for attending the presentation. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
And thank you for inviting us. Thank you for inviting me as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. And this has been recorded and will be uploaded to the Greenbelt Museum's YouTube channel in the next few days. So thanks again. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you for a wonderful
Bye.
presentation.
Thank you.
Thank
Really
you.
enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.